So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our two invited speakers for today. So we have with us here in the room, Dr. Erin Clarke from the University of Newcastle, and she's going to be speaking about dietary patterns related to heart disease, primary and secondary prevention. And we also have online Dr. Helen Williams from the University of Sydney, and I'm about to introduce Helen now. So I'd now like to introduce our first speaker, so Dr. Helen Williams. Dr. Williams completed her PhD at the University of Sydney in 2011, examining the metabolic profile of genetically modified mouse models. Dr. Williams is a scientist working at Westmead Hospital to improve the diagnoses and treatment of patients with cardiovascular disease. So her research now investigates the underlying mechanisms of cardiovascular disease, specifically the role of monocytes in the development of fatty plaques in the blood vessel walls. So thank you very much, Helen. I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you, Hayley. So I'm just sharing my screen now. Thank you for inviting me to present today. It's a bit unfortunate that I can't be there in person. I would have loved to be able to join everyone. But because I've got a young baby just outside, I thought it's better that I just stay put and minimize the chance of, howling in the room. So I would like to thank Hayley for giving that wonderful introduction and acknowledgement of country. I'm presenting from Dark and Young Land today. And so I'd like to extend my respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging, and also extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who have joined us today. So I'm going to start off with a question, and you certainly don't have to raise your hand or to write this in the comments, but I just want to ask you, who knows their cholesterol levels? And the reason I'm asking you this is because when I give this sort of talk to the community, I quite often find that hardly anyone is aware of it. And a lot of this is probably because the doctors don't actually recommend you get your cholesterol checked until you're about 40 years old, at which point you get a fairly little letter that says, oh, you've turned 40, how about you go have a health check, including cholesterol? But generally, it's not something that's really pushed on people to go do. Now, why is this an issue? Because the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare estimates that 2 in 3 Australians have dyslipidemia, so abnormal blood lipid levels. And this can manifest as high levels of total cholesterol, high LDL or bad cholesterol, high triglycerides, or low levels of HDL cholesterol, which is good cholesterol. Now, you may think that this is predominantly going to be in those older people, considering that I said doctors ask you to get checked when you're sort of 40-ish. So these are the older ages here. But you notice even in these younger age groups, such as people who are, say, presenting as rising stars, they are having also about 50% of them affected by dyslipidemia. So maybe you think, okay, yeah, people have dyslipidemia, but surely they know if they have it and they'd know it's a problem. No, actually, only 10% of people who have dyslipidemia reported this condition as an underlying condition they were aware of. That means one of two things. Either they weren't aware that they had dyslipidemia, or that they were aware that they had it, but didn't really think of it as a problem. And so that means that 78% of people who have dyslipidemia are unmedicated. Now, a little bit more, we have dyslipidemia, which is something that you'd expect to be in 2 in 3 people in the general population. And this is generally slightly elevated cholesterol levels. But there are also more severe forms of dyslipidemia, such as familial hypercholesterolaemia. Now, this is an inherited condition that is due to mutations in the cholesterol pathways. Its frequency is only between 1 in 200 to 1 in 350 people. But despite this, it is the most common genetic cause of cardiovascular disease. Now, it's inherited in a dominant fashion, which means that if a parent has it, there's a very good chance that children will have it too. So if a parent has a homozygous version of this condition, then there's a 50% chance that children will be affected. Now, it results in very high levels of LDL cholesterol. So someone with high cholesterol might have a value of, say, 5.5 millimolar or 6 millimolar for their cholesterol. But someone with familial hypercholesterolemia typically has a cholesterol level of above 7.5 millimolar. Now, you might think that if you had this condition, surely you'd know about it. But we can't actually feel high cholesterol levels. And so you might not be aware of having this condition either. In fact, only about 10% of cases, people who have familial hypercholesterolemia are diagnosed. Now, this is important because the people who have familial hypercholesterolemia have a high risk of premature cardiovascular events. And this was said to be 30% of women by age 60 and 50% of men by age 50. That might not sound too bad. You might think, oh, 50s and 60s, people who don't have high cholesterol have heart attacks at those ages too. But in the 25 to 39 age group, there was an increased risk of cardiovascular events. So there was a 7 to 13 times increased incidence of myocardial infarction. And so that means young people who have familial hypercholesterolemia are at a great excess risk of having these cardiovascular events. Now, a little bit more about lipids and cardiovascular disease. You're probably fairly familiar with these Framingham risk calculators that take into account things like your sex, your smoking status, diabetes status to determine your risk of either developing cardiovascular disease or having a cardiovascular event. Now, blowing up one of these squares, which happens to be men aged 55 to 64 years who are non-smokers, you can see that across any line of blood pressure, because there's an increased risk with blood pressure as well, you get an increase in the risk of cardiovascular disease development as your total cholesterol over HDL cholesterol increases. So we move through from being a low to moderate risk or moderate to high risk based on what your blood pressure is. And so it's important for people to be aware of their lipid factors and their cholesterol levels, regardless of their other risk factors, because it can have an impact on your cardiovascular disease risk, and because you often don't know that you've got this problem until it's actually manifested in some way. So another important contributor to the development of cardiovascular disease is inflammation. And some studies have described lipids and inflammation as two sides of the same coin when it comes to the development of atherosclerosis. High levels of LDL cholesterol are causally linked to the development of atherosclerosis. And so if you feed mice a high-fat diet, they're going to get atherosclerosis. And conversely, if you can lower the LDL levels in animals, then you can get a reduction or regression of atherosclerosis. Now, another important thing that happens during the development of atherosclerosis is inflammatory monocyte influx. And so you get monocytes entering into the atherosclerotic plaque from the circulation. And this happens a lot during atherosclerosis, but if you can block those cells from getting in there, then you can stop atherosclerosis from happening in animal models. So lipids and inflammation go hand in hand. And one of the key questions our group has is, does one of them lead the other? So when I talk about inflammation in atherosclerosis, I'm predominantly focusing on monocyte and macrophage cells. These are the inflammatory cells that our group is particularly interested in. Now, when other people talk about monocytes in cardiovascular disease, they often focus on monocyte subsets, because in the circulation, there are three subsets of monocytes: classical, intermediate, and non-classical. They differ based on their expression of the markers CD14 and CD16, and so you can categorize them pretty easily. Now, a lot of studies have found that if you get an increase in the intermediate or non-classical monocytes, that there is cardiovascular disease. So people who have a risk or presence of cardiovascular disease tend to have more of these monocyte subsets. And that information, coupled with the fact that these monocytes can secrete inflammatory cytokines, leads most people to say that these are important in cardiovascular disease, intermediate non-classical monocytes. But we're looking at monocytes in a slightly different way. So when monocytes enter into the plaque, they can become macrophages. And there are two main types of macrophages they can become. While realistically macrophages exist in a big spectrum, the two types we're going to focus on are M1 and M2 macrophages. M1s are considered to be inflammatory. They have the marker CD86, among others. They can secrete inflammatory cytokines. And when they're present, they tend to make a plaque less stable. M2 macrophages, on the other hand, are considered to be healing macrophages. They secrete things like extracellular matrix and collagen, and they express the marker CD163. When we've looked at plaque samples that are either stable or unstable, we see differences in the proportion of M1 and M2 macrophages. Specifically, unstable plaques that are more likely to rupture and cause clinical events have lots of these M1 macrophages, whereas more stable plaques have lots of these M2 macrophages. And so what we're interested in is whether monocytes can show markers of becoming either M2 or M1 macrophages before they even enter the plaque, because we've noted that they do express the markers CD86 and CD163. So not only are we looking at that, but we're also interested in whether dyslipidemia can cause skewing towards either these M1 or M2-like monocytes to influence whether they become those macrophages of interest in the plaque. So the aims and methods here, I'm presenting from a few different studies, but our approaches are fairly similar. So I've kind of lumped it together and it makes a good story together. So the first question is, what monocyte inflammatory changes are seen in people who have established cardiovascular disease? The next question is whether people who are at risk of cardiovascular disease, such as people with familial hypercholesterolemia, have inflammatory changes. And importantly, whether if they can lower their lipid levels with treatment, whether that can get rid of any inflammatory changes. And lastly, we wanted to know if people who have fairly normal cholesterol levels also have inflammatory changes in their monocytes. In terms of approach, we take blood samples from all of these groups, and we use whole blood flow cytometry to look at the M1 and M2 markers on the monocytes, as well as looking at the lipid profile of these people. So the first results I'm presenting are the cardiovascular disease patients. And we found that they have inflammatory monocyte changes despite a lot of this population being on statins and having their cholesterol levels reduced to a fairly normal level. So the first result here is the intermediate monocyte proportion. You may recall that I said the intermediate monocytes are considered by others to be inflammatory and are generally elevated in cardiovascular disease. And indeed, that's what we saw. There was an elevation in the proportion of intermediate monocytes in our cardiovascular disease cohort. So great. But then the next thing we wanted to know is whether they showed that M1, M2 skewing, indicating they might be more likely to become a specific type of macrophage in the plaque. And we saw that was present too. So the cardiovascular disease patients had higher levels of CD86 relative to CD163, indicating they're skewed towards being an M1-like type and are more likely to become M1 macrophages once they get into the plaque. Now, you might think that a change in markers might not really mean much, but we've also shown that this has some inflammatory function come with it. So when we saw high levels of CD86 over CD163 on these monocytes, those same cells released a lot of interleukin-1 beta, which is an inflammatory cytokine. So not only are they more likely to become macrophages once they get into the plaque, but they're already doing a little bit of damage in the circulation by secreting inflammatory cytokines. One thing we wanted to look at then is whether the M1, M2 skewing had some kind of relationship to lipids, because of course we're interested in dyslipidemia. And what we saw was a negative correlation with HDL cholesterol. So low levels of HDL cholesterol are of course problematic because it can be considered a protective lipid. And the people in this cohort with low levels of HDL had the higher levels of M1 relative to M2 markers. So on to the next group, familial hypercholesterolemia patients. They also had inflammatory changes in their monocytes that persisted despite statin treatment. Now, while this is still a work in progress, and so the work I'm showing you for this one is unpublished, it's important to note that we have three groups here, controls, and then there are two groups for FH, untreated and treated. So untreated means they're not currently taking any lipid-lowering medication, and the treated means they're currently on a type of lipid-lowering medication. Now, I can tell you that this was a successful lipid-lowering treatment in this case because the people who were on the statins came down to normal levels for their cholesterol. So we've successfully addressed the risk of their high cholesterol. Have we successfully addressed the inflammatory changes if they occur? Unfortunately, no. So while we didn't see any changes in the monocyte subset proportions, so there were no changes in those classical, intermediate, or non-classical monocytes, our M1, M2 skewing showed an interesting change that was not resolved by statins. So here we've got the controls, and here you can see both the untreated and treated FH groups have higher levels of these M1 relative to M2 markers. And so regardless of their cholesterol levels being reduced to normal in this treated group, their CD86 over 163 or M1 skewing is still the same as those people who weren't receiving treatment, which we found very interesting and a little bit sad. So then on to another thing we did. We wanted to see if whether this M1 skewing on those monocytes meant they were more likely to become M1 macrophages, because the effect of the environment is also important. And so here we found the monocyte ratio of CD86 over 163 correlated nicely with the macrophage ratio of CD163. So if you take monocytes that are skewed to become M1-like and pop them into culture, they definitely will form those M1 macrophages, which means they're likely to be doing the same thing in the plaques. And if that's the case, then this M1 skewing could lead to more M1 macrophages in the plaques and to instability, which leads to clinical events. So not only do FH patients have an increased risk due to their lipids being elevated, but they've also got inflammatory changes that don't seem to be resolved by statin treatment. So you might think, I don't have cardiovascular disease. I don't have familial hypercholesterolemia. That means I'm safe, right? Unfortunately, probably not. We found that in a fairly normal cholesterol cohort, there was a correlation of M1 markers, CD86 and TLR2 with cholesterol over HDL ratio. So admittedly, some of the numbers up here are people who probably have some kind of dyslipidemia that they don't actually know about. There is this correlation that suggests that if you're getting moving away from being the healthy, best ideal lipid profile, then chances are your monocytes are also moving away to be a bit more inflammatory. That correlation was negative with HDL and positive with cholesterol over HDL, which suggests that HDL may be the main component that influences this, but the LDL cholesterol can't be discounted either. So in summary, what have I told you? Cardiovascular disease patients have inflammatory monocyte changes. So do people who have familial hypercholesterolemia. So that suggests that these changes can occur before cardiovascular disease develops. Now, even though people in these groups were statin treated and had their cholesterol levels reduced to that of healthy controls, the monocytes did not resume to a healthy control level. And even though we saw some correlations with cholesterol, that would indicate that you'd think that if you reduce the cholesterol levels, you'd be able to fix this problem. But no, it doesn't happen that way. So the correlation exists, but it doesn't work such that if you can reduce those levels that you can return things to normal. And so changes induced by lipids, even in healthy people, can't easily be undone. A bit like once you crack an egg, you're not going to be able to put it back together. So what are the next steps? First of all, we're interested in learning about the precise causes. So what causes these monocytes to get skewed to an inflammatory profile? And then once we know about the causes, maybe we can stop them in their tracks. Can we stop these monocytes from becoming M1 skewed? What if we get there too late and they're already skewed? Well, then can we reverse it? Is there something we can administer that would make these monocytes that are inflammatory in the circulation become less inflammatory in the circulation? And one last thing before I go, another way we're working and looking in some deeper detail is by banking samples from people who have familial hypercholesterolemia. So we're going to be taking blood samples from people who have this condition, storing the blood products at the New South Wales Health Statewide Biobank, and then looking at the inflammatory changes that have occurred here. Now, the great thing about this is it also allows us to link to clinical outcomes, which means we can see how these inflammatory changes are influencing the outcomes in this population. So that's what I've got for you today. I'd like to thank you all for listening and paying attention and looking at our beautiful team here. I'd be very happy to answer any questions anyone has. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen, for that really interesting and insightful presentation. Helen, online. Oh, no, that's a clap. That's not a hand up. That's okay. Does anyone online have any questions or anybody in the room? Maybe Helen, I could, oh, sorry. Yep. No? Yeah. Oh, yep. Okay. We've got Doan in the room here. Yep.
Hi, it's Dawn here from University of Newcastle. Wonderful presentation, Helen. Very interesting results. Can I just ask a simple question to begin with? Would be, what was the age group of the patients that you were normal lipids?
We had quite a range there. I'd have to look it up, but it started from people as young as sort of 18, 19 and went up to people in their 60s. And so we had quite an age range for the controls. Within the FH study, it was generally a younger age group because this is something that manifests fairly early. And in the cardiovascular disease cohort, we had people mostly around their 60s, so the controls were around the same age in that one.
So did you see a correlation with age as well as to the inflammatory factors from these patients, even though they have normal lipid ranges?
We actually did look at it and didn't see it, although we can't guarantee that it was powered to detect a difference in age because we didn't design the study to do that. And so while we looked and didn't see a significant correlation, I'd have to go back and see if a correlation did exist, whether we were powered to detect it in our study, because I'm pretty certain other people have seen that there are some, that there are generally changes with age.
Thank you.
All right. No one else there? I might, sorry?
Isabella Tans.
Oh, Isabella, thank you. Excellent.
Hi, great talk, Helen. It was really, really interesting. I was just wondering, in those people, even though when you lowered their cholesterol levels, it didn't make a difference in the skewing, does the high density, like HDL, actually play a role? Like I think you showed at the end that the cholesterol and HDL ratio would have a role in the skewing of those monocytes. But so if you lowered the LDL and increased the HDL, would that be beneficial at all, or does it not?
I suspect it would be, because we do see the correlations with HDL, and statins don't tend to have much impact on HDL. And so it might be that low HDL rather than high LDL is the main thing driving the skewing, and that if you could increase people's HDL levels, you could see a positive outcome. So yes, I suspect that would work out quite nicely. Although people tend to have problems trying to increase their HDL levels. So it tends to be a fairly, something that's fairly strongly influenced by your genetics. And so you might be lucky and have inherited high HDL cholesterol from your family. I personally have inherited high HDL from my mum, but also high-ish LDL from my dad. So I'm kind of like a tricky balancing act myself. But yes, I do think that would be therapeutically beneficial. So yeah, I'd say go for it if there is a good way to increase your HDL levels.
More avocados, maybe?
I love avocados, and yeah, maybe.
Thank you, Helen.
I've
Thanks,
seen
Helen.
one in the chat. Did you want me to
Yeah.
read that out, or did you want to?
Yeah, look, just
You're muted.
was there a gender difference?
In the monocyte
Just want to
skewing
comment
conditions.
on any gender differences?
No, there wasn't. Again, we looked at in the same way we looked at correlations with age. We didn't see a difference between males and females in this. But again, we didn't necessarily power it for that. And so if there was a subtle difference, we might not be able to detect it because it was about 30 people per group when it was the cardiovascular disease one, and about 30 health controls in the dyslipidemia one. And so I guess I don't want to say that there is no difference because we didn't power it to look for that difference. Now, I've got also in the chat from Catherine, I'll just read it out just in case people aren't looking in the chat. If you block or inhibit M1 macrophages, is there a risk of creating immunity issues? Do you have a plan as to how to selectively target the macrophages in the plaque? Now, that is an absolutely wonderful question because that is one of the main problems with when you do anti-inflammatory targeting. And so when people try to look at reducing inflammation in cardiovascular disease or in any other conditions, quite often it's met with things like infection happening as well because you've messed with the immune system. And so there's certainly a risk of creating immunity issues if you're targeting inflammation. You have to be very careful with what you do. And so sometimes you'll have something that's very successful in animal models, but then you don't want to try it in people because there's too great of a risk of you, well, killing people or something like that. So in terms of do we have a plan as to how to selectively target those macrophages in the plaque? We tried some animal studies ourselves where we tried to inject M2 macrophages into the circulation and get them to go to the plaque, but the macrophages just didn't go to the plaque itself. In wound healing, people have done things to cause M1 macrophages to switch into M2. So delivering exosomes so things released by M2 macrophages can convert the M1s there to M2s, which is great when you've got a wound that you can directly administer to. But in terms of atherosclerosis, because it's in your circulatory system, it's much harder to directly target a specific plaque. And so, yeah, there's some very good questions that I don't have very good answers to other than telling you what people are trying to do and that we certainly don't have a brilliant answer yet.
Thanks, Helen. And maybe just one more question I had is, do you have any thoughts about the actual causes or how you'd stop the inflammatory changes?
Yeah, so to get a better idea of the causes, one of my colleagues, Heather Medbury, is doing some work. So she's trying to look at isolated lipid components. And so when I was describing to Isabella how we don't necessarily know the exact impact of HDL or LDL, Heather's getting a big cohort of people together that vary based on all of these different lipid factors. And she's trying to kind of get an idea of which specific lipid factor or factors are the causes. And she's also coupling that with some in vitro work, so trying to directly administer specific lipids to see if they can alter the monocyte or macrophage skewing as well. And so, yes, we're looking into what can cause it. And I believe you said something else and I didn't hear or didn't remember the second part of what you said.
Just any thoughts on how you'd stop the inflammatory changes?
So targeting the risk factors before they have been existing for too long would be the best way to do that. And so if someone found out that they had cholesterol that was starting to creep up, trying to stop that cholesterol level from getting higher so it can't do the damage would be your best bet there. So try to prevent rather than cure seems most likely. But because most people don't know they have high cholesterol until it becomes a big issue, then it's not too likely that's going to happen. And as I always chat to Heather and say, look, if someone told me that I needed to start taking statins now to stop myself from getting cardiovascular disease down the line, I probably wouldn't do it. Like I might have a slightly better diet or I might exercise a bit more, but I can't guarantee you that I'd take medicine to prevent it. So I think that, yeah, trying to target diet and exercise before it becomes a problem is your best bet. And hopefully Erin talking about that will give us an idea of what sorts of diets would be beneficial for, for this sort of thing.
Thanks, Helen. That's a perfect segue into our second speaker. So I'd now like to introduce Dr. Erin Clarke. So Erin is an accredited practicing dietitian, an early career researcher at the University of Newcastle. She completed her Bachelor of Nutrition and Dietetics with Honours Class 1 in 2016 and a PhD in Nutrition and Dietetics in 2021, both at the University of Newcastle. She works both clinically and as a practicing dietitian and a researcher. Erin's research interests include the relationship between diet quality and health, dietary assessment, and dietary biomarkers. Welcome, Erin. So thanks for having me. So today I'll be talking about the dietary patterns for the prevention of both primary and secondary heart disease. And this is just some results from a few systematic reviews we've been working on. So in 2019, a quarter of all Australian deaths were caused by heart disease. And currently 57% of Australian adults have 3 or more modifiable risk factors for heart disease. And diet is one of those modifiable risk factors. So overall, Australia's diet quality is poor. So with 90% of Australians not meeting fruit and vegetable targets, which is 2 serves of fruits and 5 serves of veggies a day. And approximately a third of Australians' energy intake does come from discretionary foods. So these are foods like your fried foods, lollies, chips, chocolate, baked goods, and processed meats. So the initial focus of research in nutrition for health was, and especially heart health, was very nutrient focused. So this was focusing on things like reducing sodium intake and saturated fats, as well as increasing things like potassium and our unsaturated fats. Then the focus moved more towards whole foods. So these looked more like reducing our intake of those discretionary foods I mentioned, and limiting our red meat intake, and then increasing things like fruits, veggies, and whole grains. But now we're starting to move more towards focusing on overall dietary patterns, as people eat more than just individual foods and nutrients. And what we eat consistently over time, not just at any one occasion, impacts our health and our overall risk of heart disease. So dietary patterns are defined as the quantities, proportions, variety, or combination of different foods and beverages in diets and the frequency in which they are habitually consumed. So there's a lot of overlap with the foods classified in those healthier dietary patterns. So all of them recommend increased amounts of core foods such as fruits, veggies, and whole grains. And a large proportion also recommend things like beans and legumes, fish, and low-fat dairy. So a couple of examples. So the Mediterranean diet recommends increased consumption of fruits, veggies, whole grains, fish, and those vegetarian proteins such as beans and legumes. The dietary approaches to stop hypertension, or the DASH diet, recommends increased amounts of fruits, veggies, whole grains, low-fat dairy, and lean meats. And a plant-based dietary pattern, such as the portfolio diet, recommends an increased amounts of fruit, veggies, whole grains, and those vegetarian proteins. So the first favourable relationship between a healthy dietary pattern and a lower risk of heart disease was identified in the 60s. And over the last 2 decades, there has been increasing research on dietary patterns and the relationship with health being conducted. So there's a cross-cultural analysis of the 7 countries study cohort revealed that the Mediterranean-style dietary pattern, with its high consumption of olive oil and plant-based foods, were positively correlated with 25-year coronary heart disease and mortality rates. And other research has shown that higher compared to lower diet quality scores, so that's the healthier diets, measured using the DASH diet score, the healthy eating index, and the alternative healthy eating index, have shown to reduce the risk of heart disease incidence and mortality. But a lot of the evidence regarding dietary patterns for heart health focus either on those singular measures of heart health or disease, or limits diet quality assessment tools or the indices used. So therefore, the aims of these 2 systematic reviews that I'll be talking about today are to extend on the findings from these previous reviews by not limiting the dietary assessment tools and indices or the heart disease outcomes as well. We want to determine the relationship between diet quality and heart disease incidence and mortality, and to summarise dietary patterns for primary and secondary prevention of heart disease. So what dietary patterns do we look for the primary prevention of heart disease? So this is an unpublished systematic review, which was undertaken looking at 6 databases, and these were searched between January 2007 and October 2021. So the search terms used here were related to diet, dietary patterns, and cardiovascular disease. And the studies were screened for inclusion by the team, and study characteristics and outcomes were extracted. So the inclusion criteria for the primary prevention of heart disease included cohort studies using a priori or a predefined diet quality measure,
and measured morbidity and mortality of heart disease. So a meta-analysis was performed for the risk ratio of heart disease incidence and mortality among the highest, so those better quality diets versus the lowest or the least healthy diet quality using random effects models. Studies were grouped by the relevant outcomes, including heart disease incidence and mortality. Heart disease incidence included the combined fatal and non-fatal cases, while heart disease mortality included outcomes of fatality associated with heart disease. So we did a subgroup analysis where we looked at specific dietary patterns, and this included the healthy eating index, the Mediterranean diet score, group things as adherence to dietary guidelines, so this is like such as the healthy diet indicator, and adherence to heart healthy guidelines, so like the DASH diet, the American Heart Association diet scores, anti-inflammatory diets, plant-based diet scores, and low carbohydrate diets. So 4,780 articles were identified from the search, and 159 cohort studies met the inclusion criteria and were included in this review. The majority of studies were published after 2013, and almost all of them were published in high-income countries. The sample size did range from 49 to 450-ish thousand people, and a total of about 6.2 million adults were included. And more than half of the included participants were middle-aged or older. So food frequency questionnaires were the most commonly used dietary assessment method, and 15 major types of diet quality indexes were used. The most commonly used diet indexes were the Mediterranean diet score, healthy eating index, and the DASH diet score, and 42% of studies used 2 or more diet quality indexes. So the meta-analysis that was looking at the relationship between diet quality and incidence of heart disease was made up of 42 studies consisting of 97 diet quality indexes, comparing the highest versus the lowest diet quality. And this model demonstrated that the high diet quality, so those healthier diets, were significantly lowering the risk of heart disease events, including both those combined fatal and non-fatal cases, by 17%. The I-squared statistic did indicate some significant heterogeneity, and there's also evidence of publication bias favouring those studies with those larger effect sizes. So the sensitivity analysis showed that there was a significant difference in the risk of heart disease incidence by the type of diet quality index. So the Mediterranean diet score, heart healthy guidelines such as that DASH diet, and anti-inflammatory diet did show a significantly lower risk of heart disease incidence in those who had those high diet quality scores compared to the lower scores. So essentially those who had healthier diets measured by those kind of indexes did significantly lower the risk of heart disease. And then the meta-analysis, which was looking at the relationship between diet quality and heart disease mortality, was made up of 49 studies, and this consisted of 111 diet quality indexes, comparing again the highest versus lowest diet quality. This model demonstrated that a high diet quality, so again those healthier diets, significantly reduced the risk of heart disease mortality by 17%. Again, the I-squared statistic did indicate substantial heterogeneity, but there was no evidence of publication bias in this model. So the sensitivity analysis for heart disease mortality did show as well that there was significant difference in the risk of heart disease mortality by the type of diet index used. So the Mediterranean diet, heart healthy diet guidelines, adherence to dietary guidelines, the healthy eating index, and plant-based diet scores did show a significantly lower risk of heart disease mortality in those who had the higher diet quality, or again, those healthier diet quality scores compared to lower diet quality scores. So once somebody has heart disease, what dietary patterns do we recommend to prevent secondary cardiovascular events? So again, another systematic review was undertaken. This one did look at primary and secondary prevention of heart disease, but today I'll just be focusing on the secondary prevention findings. So 7 databases were searched between January 2010 and November 2016, looking for systematic reviews and meta-analyses that were exploring the relationship between dietary patterns for primary and or secondary prevention of heart disease. Research terms again were quite similar, so they look at diet, dietary patterns, and cardiovascular disease for primary and secondary prevention. And again, the studies were screened for inclusion by the team and study characteristics and outcomes extracted. So no restriction was placed on the types of studies that made up the review, with reviews on randomised control trials through to observational studies included. And it also included both a priori, so that predefined, or a posteriori and empirically derived dietary pattern assessments. So 33 systematic reviews met the inclusion criteria. 3 of these reviews did focus specifically on dietary patterns for secondary prevention of heart disease. And out of the 16 evidence statements that were developed, 3 did focus specifically on secondary prevention of heart disease. So this found that the portfolio diet, so that's that largely vegetarian-based diet that consists of high fruits, veggie, whole grain intakes, was associated with a reduction in blood lipids for those who had pre-existing hyperlipidemia. The DASH diet, which also recommends similar intakes of those kind of foods, plus low-fat dairy and a reduction in sodium intake, was associated with improvements in blood pressure. And a weight loss or a calorie-restricted diet for at least 6 months was associated with improvements in blood pressure and body weight in those with pre-existing heart disease. So overall, the meta-analysis indicated that those who had the highest diet quality measured across all dietary indexes were associated with a 17% reduction in heart disease incidence and mortality. Significant heterogeneity is likely due to the wide range of dietary assessment methods used, as well as the different types of diet indexes used. The heart health benefits arising from dietary patterns may be attributed to the emphasis on consumption of those commonly recommended foods, such as a diversity in fruits, veggies, whole grains, lean meats, and fish and seafood. And these foods are recommended in commonly used diet quality indexes such as the Mediterranean diet score, the DASH diet score, and the healthy eating index, which have all been shown to reduce the risk of heart disease. The portfolio, DASH, and a calorie restricted diet are recommended for the secondary prevention of heart disease. So what does this mean in research and in practice? So in research, it is recommended to use existing diet quality indexes to ensure that the tools that are used are applicable to the study setting, including the relevant national dietary guidelines, nutrient reference recommended values, as well as gender and age groups of interest. To understand what foods contribute to higher diet quality and promote increased intakes of these foods, including encouraging those foods like fruits, veggies, whole grains, lean meats, and fish. It is also recommended that with people that are at high risk or those with pre-existing heart disease do see an accredited practicing dietitian for that individualised advice, and for qualified health professionals to continue to upskill in nutrition communication as well, so they can also assist in providing that advice. As well as in practice, it's important to promote diet quality for the primary and secondary prevention of heart disease. So for primary prevention, higher diet quality measured through a range of different indexes can be used, but the best option is probably the one the patient feels is most achievable and focuses on those core foods for heart health. And for secondary prevention, again, the portfolio followed by the DASH and an MFG restricted diet are most beneficial for patients who already have pre-existing heart disease to prevent their risk of secondary events. So in conclusion, for the primary prevention of heart disease, high diet quality measured through a range of different indexes was associated with a reduced risk of heart disease incidence and mortality. And for secondary prevention of heart disease, the portfolio diet, DASH, and calorie-restricted dietary patterns are recommended. But overall, people should still aim to increase their intakes of fruits, veggies, whole grains, lean meats, fish, and seafood to align with diets with those healthier dietary patterns. Thanks to everyone. Thanks to everybody who collaborated on these projects, including the team from the University of Newcastle and our collaborators in Sweden and the Netherlands. Thanks.
Thanks, Erin. Definitely some interesting dietary recommendations there. Have we got any questions that anybody would like to ask of Erin initially?
Did you have
Helen? Thank you.
Yeah, look, I admit I was breastfeeding at the time, so I might have missed it, but why would you think different diets would work better for primary and secondary prevention? I would have thought that pretty much, as you said, any diet's good, but you noted that different ones tend to work a bit better in either case. So any thoughts on why that might be?
Yeah, so a lot of those diets did kind of encompass similar foods and food recommendations. So I guess most of the research is in that primary prevention setting, so just trying to prevent people that either are at risk or just preventing the overall population from getting heart disease. And there is limited research in that secondary prevention stage. So it's more just to kind of keep looking just to see that we're not actually missing anything what we're recommending to patients. But it does seem like things like the DASH diet and like those more plant-based dietary patterns do have a pretty good, like they're very beneficial for people at both primary and secondary prevention. So I definitely encourage those kind of dietary patterns, if that answers your question.
All right, thanks, Helen. If there's no other questions online, we've got one from the room.
Hi, it's Duan again. Just a quick one. Do you think these dietary patterns helps with weight loss, and how does that contribute to protection against primary, secondary?
Yeah, so weight loss, it's probably a bit of a controversial space at the moment. So there's definitely that evidence, like we also found that those energy restricted dietary patterns are really helpful for people who've already had cardiovascular events. And there is a lot of evidence that, people with overweight and obesity are at risk of these diseases. But I guess like diet quality is something like you can lose weight, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're improving your health. So people can do crash diets, they can do even like something like a keto diet that is quite high in fat and saturated fat, but they've just reduced their energy intake. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to benefit their health. Where like we focus on dietary patterns, does put a more positive spin on what we're recommending as well. And there is a lot of evidence, again, that those fruits, veggies, whole grain options are really beneficial alongside like whether or not you do lose weight. So that answer your question.
All right, Erin, I did have one question for you. If you had to pick a dietary pattern that you would recommend for improving heart health, which one would you recommend?
Yeah, I think like most of the evidence does steer towards that DASH dietary pattern because it looks at like your whole foods, so looking at fruits, veggies, whole grains, those leaner meats, but it also emphasizes like lower sodium intakes as well, which a lot of the other dietary patterns don't mention, and that's really beneficial for lowering blood pressure and as well as lowering those risks for primary and secondary prevention of heart disease.
So, food for thought for everybody. All right, just inviting any final questions for Erin. Thanks, Isabella.
Sorry, thanks so much, Erin. That was really great talk and a lot of work that you put in there. I was just wondering, sorry if I missed it, but how many of these studies were actual like intervention studies whereby they actually put people on the diet and then compared to someone who wasn't on that diet?
Yeah, so in the first review, that was all cohort studies, so we didn't get any intervention studies. Oh, I did look this up this morning, but I can't remember how many in the secondary prevention actually were the intervention rather than the cohort studies. Intervention rather than the cohort. But like from like all the reading and that, there is still pretty minimal interventions looking at the dietary pattern. So a lot of it is cohort based, but now they're starting to kind of look at the interventions as well, and there's much less evidence out there. So there's definitely a need for more of that research.
Great, thank you.
All right, if there's no other burning questions, we might let Erin off the hook. Thank you. Thanks, Erin. Okay. Well, that concludes our speakers for today. So just before we finish, just introduce our July seminar. We have Dr. Lauren Christie from the University of Newcastle again, who'll be speaking about implementation of evidence-based practice in stroke, and Dr. Bola Fashuba from the Australian Catholic University, who'll be talking about registry data to improve stroke care practice, an international cross-sectional survey of registry of stroke care quality in hospitals. So that will be some really interesting speakers coming around again next month.